Today we have a fantastic treat here on Inside the Cockpit, a Bf109. We are at the Messerschmitt Stiftung in Manching, Germany, where we're going to have a look here at Rote 7, a Bf109 G4. Now, we're going to talk about the aircraft on the outside, and then, as always, we're going to jump inside. Big thank you here, of course, to the Messerschmitt Stiftung for giving us access to this aircraft. Up front, of course, we have the VDM, variable pitch propeller, that is being powered by the powerhouse of this aircraft. Now, this specific aircraft started its life as a Buchon, a Spanish 109, but then was retrofitted with an actual Daimler-Benz engine. This is the DB605A, which is the standard engine that you would find on the G series, although you could also sometimes find the AS and the AM version of that engine as well. At its highest setting, this V12 liquid-cooled engine pumps out 1,475 horsepower. Now that's incredibly specific, but we are in Germany. Otherwise I would have said roughly 1,500 horsepower. But it does that at a power setting of 2,800 RPMs with 1.42 on your ATA. Of course, that is full power. You're not going to be able to run that engine at that setting for too long. So for continuous, well, first combat and then for continuous, you're dropping down the RPMs and the pressure. For continuous, we're setting around about 2,300 RPMs and 1.15 on your ATA. Behind the engine as well, we find the oil tank of the aircraft, 36 liters there, and that is of course used for the oil cooler of the engine. The liquid cooling is installed in the wings on each side, just outboard of the fuselage, near the wing root, just down there. Then moving towards the wing. Now with the G series of the 109, we're starting to see an increase in weight of the aircraft, specifically also due to the engine, which means that the gear was strengthened throughout the lifespan of the G series. The wheel size was also increased, which is why this bulge suddenly starts appearing in the gear well to fit that gear. Walking then along the leading edge, we find, of course, these slats, courtesy of de Havilland, in a license exchange with Willy Messerschmitt in the, I believe, early 1930s. They got a wing design from him and returned the favor with slats. We have navigational lighting on the wingtips, and then we come to, of course, the aileron with a fixed trim tab right here. Moving along the trailing edge, we find the flaps, plane flaps, 40 degrees deflection, and then we come to the cooler flaps, which are also coupled to the actual aircraft flaps as well. Then, as we come to the cockpit, notice up front we have an integral armored windscreen. This was a modification with the G series. Before that it was modular, so you could add it with the G series. It came built in. And also throughout the life of the G model, the actual canopy, which would be hinged outwards towards our side now, was changing as well with better vision ports and angles. Plus the armor that was actually installed to the back of the pilot, roughly able to withstand heavy machine gun firepower, was also changed in the cockpit so that it includes an armored, well, not a windscreen, but sort of a rear screen that you could look through, but still it offers protection towards the pilot. The pilot sits himself on a fuel tank, self-sealing, with 400 liters capacity, which provided enough fuel for around about 1 hour, maybe 1.5 hours, 1 hours if you want to really stretch it to the maximum. Moving then towards the tail. The aircraft itself weighs about 2,500 kilograms, going all the way up to 3,300 for maximum takeoff weight. Coming to the tail, we have a relatively small tail, elevator, fixed trim tabs, rudder, fixed rudder tab, navigational lighting, of course, and the gear that you see there, even though on the earlier G2 models, once we get to the G4, the gear starts being non-retractable again, just to avoid the complexity during production. Internals then, let's talk about those. Depending on how your G model was set up, the internals change a little bit. The biggest change from the G2 over to the G4 was that a new Funkgerät, so a new radio, was added. Instead of the FUG Funkgerät 7A, you find the FUG 16, which was a much better radio, offered a much better communication with other planes and also ground installations. It was just more clear coming through and had also longer ranges. Sometimes in these aircraft you would also add the Zielflug Vorsatzgerät 16, which was a DF homing antenna, but apparently this wasn't always mounted just when you really required it. In some of the G models, especially the later G models, once we have the Mk108 cannon being installed on the nose, you would also find the compressed air container that were needed for the pneumatic charging of the guns right about here. But if we're taking this aircraft as a G4, that wouldn't be mounted just yet. We also would have the aerial mast mounted right here with the aerial strung all the way towards the tail. Now, moving towards the port wingtip, let's start talking about the aircraft in its combat orientation. Pitot tube right here. But what we would have, generally speaking, if you had to carry something on your center line, you would be generally limited to a 250 kilogram bomb or a 300-liter drop tank to extend that range of the aircraft on longer patrols, or if you're ferrying it somewhere else. Then, of course, we're looking at the engine arrangement, but this is exactly also where the armament would be installed. So we have two machine guns up top. These are the MG-17s. 7.92 by 57 millimeters, firing around about 1,200 rounds a minute, and you have 500 rounds per gun. Since you have two, that gives you a total ammo capacity of 1,000 rounds. Now, those are installed above with the ammo chutes or the ammo drums being mounted just externally of the engine. And then we also have the MG151-20, which is a 20 by 82 millimeter machine gun. Well, it's not really a machine gun, it's actually a cannon, but it's designated as a machine gun, MG after all, in the German nomenclature. And that would sit basically installed between the cockpit and the engine, and then it fires through a extended hole in the engine through the prop hub right here in a center line position. You have 200 rounds in that gun, and it fires at a rate of fire of about 700 rounds a minute. And that machine gun, or that cannon, also has the famous Minengeschoss, which is a 20 millimeter high explosive shell featuring 20 grams of high explosive filler, which for the time was significant, since most high explosive rounds at that time were between 2 to about 6 grams of high explosive. So that's where a lot of the potency from this gun came from. Now, with that said and done on the outside, also notice, of course, the air intake and the supercharger that is mounted around here. We have some brilliant detail here with the cockpit, with the canopy, with the cowling, engine cowling being opened up. Now, however, it's time to jump inside. Jumping into the cockpit, there is the obvious question to ask. Is the 109 cockpit truly as cramped as they say? I already have a full video on this, so check that out for this question. For this video here, we will focus on the functional aspects of switches, levers and buttons, starting as always with the sweeping left to right inspection. The G model of the Bf 109 doesn't have a great track record for standardization, but what you are about to see is broadly representative of the G6. On the far lower left we see these two wheels. The outer one is for the flaps, and the inner one is for the horizontal stabilizer trim. Moving forward, the yellow mushroom-shaped button is the fuel priming pump, with the green and red handle being the left radiator cutoff. The switch for the automatic prop pitch selector is right next to this, under the throttle. Looking up, but staying on the left-hand side here, we find the tail wheel lock. And then as we move forward, we find the obligatory throttle controls. At times, this also had a press-to-talk switch for the radio. There's also on the side a propeller pitch switch in case manual pitch is selected. The red handle is for the fuel cock, and for cold start we have a red striped white handle. The yellow ball lever is the engine stop handle, and behind that you have a visual indicator as well if the gear is in or not. and a smaller handle to the side opens up the fuel flow from the belly tank. The gear release is found above this assembly. It's just two simple push rods. Moving our gaze towards the front instruments, on the lower left we find a gear position indicator. This is the electric one, not the mechanical one you saw earlier. Ein stands for in, aus for out. The red push button on this side is the cutoff for the electrical system. On this side we also find the engine starter switch, the magnetos, and this switch here that I believe is linked to the oil system, but it's a bit elusive in the sources that I have. If you have a manual that specifically answers this question on what exactly this does, please let me know in the comments. The canopy emergency release is found offset to the side. Now we move to the central instruments. This is likely the cleanest and easiest to read arrangement I have seen in a World War II fighter, and remarkably close to what we consider the norm nowadays. If you have seen other fighters in the Inside the Cockpit series, you will see what I mean as we go through this. The 109's cockpit had its share of issues. Again, watch the previous video on that. But the layout is really good for the time. Starting on the top, we have the ammo counter for the centrally installed weaponry. And below this, we have a heading and directional compass, the artificial horizon with an integrated turn and bank indicator, and below, an altimeter in kilometers and a speedometer in kilometers per hour. Moving to the right, the engine dials. On top is the ATA indicator. In function, this is basically the German equivalent to what Allied plants had with the manifold pressure indicator. There are, of course, differences in what is being measured, but in function, that's what it does. Below this, we have the RPM indicator and the prop pitch indicator. Moving further down, now with color coding, the yellow dial is the fuel gauge, and the yellow and brown one is the fuel and oil pressure. Above this, the radio direction course finder to home back to base, and a dual engine temperature dial for liquid and oil cooling. A clock is set to the top right, while the windscreen cleaner liquid release is the yellow handle and the red pull handle is the emergency gear release. Above this, the Revi gun sight, which can be stored like a targeting computer for better forward visibility. Between the pilot's legs, the covering plate for the centrally mounted cannon, which could be a 20mm MG 151-20 or the 30mm MK108 high explosive fireworks dispenser. Moving to the right, we find the Funkgerät 16, the FUG 16 radio frequency selector, and the green and white handle is the right radiator cutoff, while the switch set in front of it sets the cooling to automatic or manual or back. On the lower right, we find various additional systems. In German planes, blue signifies oxygen. This is the oxygen system with a flow and capacity dial mounted just ahead of it. The small switch is in front for the FUG 25 IFF, while the red handle is the emergency release for bombs. The two similar looking boxes are again for the FUG 25, and then we also have the radio volume control. Above all this, a couple of circuit breakers. The pedals control the yaw axis, but the stick is of course for the roll and pitch control. Let's go through the buttons here. The offset button to the side is generally the bomb release. As you can see, a safety catch covers an additional button. This would be to fire the cannon. It can only be used, however, if you move the safety catch forward, and then the safety catch becomes the trigger for the plane's guns, which is perhaps the most American thing you will ever see in a non-American plane. To the bottom of the stick then, we have the cannon charging button. And that is it, the BF 109. Oh, and by the way, if you want to sit inside this 109 cockpit, you actually can. Check out the description for the museum's access requirements and their schedule. I hope that you enjoyed this little quirky look at the cockpit of the 109, and as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.